In the spring of 1881, while the families of Bitterroot Valley stacked sandbags and prayed the snowpack would hold, Brian Calder was doing something that earned him nothing but laughter. He was building his cabin on 12-foot stilts, high above the tree line, where the wind could cut through ordinary walls. Neighbors called it the Heron House, a fool's perch. But Brian had seen something in the mountains nobody else believed yet, and when the record thaw finally came, that mockery would turn into the only dry ground left in the valley. Brian Calder had spent 5 years studying something every other settler ignored: the shape of the valleys, the path of the spring runoff, the way water carved new rivers overnight. He'd seen towns swept away in sudden thaws before. So when he built his cabin on stilts, he wasn't just building a home. He was betting his family's future on a pattern hidden in the mountains. His wife, Lisa, tried to believe him. Their son, Samuel, helped drive the pilings, but the valley called him a madman, until the thaw of '81, the biggest on record, proved otherwise. What did Brian see that no one else could? Brian had first seen water erase an entire town when he was 22 years old, a young teamster hauling supplies through the Sierra foothills. It was the winter of '62, the year the sky couldn't stop pouring. Warm rain fell on deep snow for 3 straight weeks. He'd been stranded on high ground with a broken axle and watched the valley below turn into a brown lake. Roofs slid loose and spun in the current. Cattle drowned in clusters. He heard the screaming through the rain for 2 nights, then nothing. When the water finally receded, the town of Rich Bar was gone, just mud crusted over broken timber. 34 bodies were pulled from the debris, but Brian always believed the real number was higher. He never forgot the sound of that thaw. The way the ice snapped upriver like cannon fire just before the wall of water came. It planted an obsession inside him, and he began to study floodlines the way a tracker reads game trails. He mapped where water moved, where it pooled, where it carved new channels. He'd ask questions no one else thought to ask. Why did one cabin survive a flood while another half a mile away washed out? Why did a chicken coop with its floor raised 6 inches stay dry? He saw pattern where others saw chaos. And the pattern told him the valley they all called safe was a trap waiting to be sprung. When he staked his claim in Bitterroot Valley in the spring of 1878, other settlers had already chosen the low, flat ground near the creek. The soil was rich, the water easy to draw. Brian chose the bench land halfway up the slope, a rocky stretch nobody wanted. Then he started digging post holes, not for a fence, not for a barn, for 16 massive cedar pilings, each 12 feet long and 2 feet thick, sunk 4 feet into the frozen earth. The frame that rose above them looked absurd, a square box of a cabin suspended in the air, reachable only by a ladder. People stopped their wagons to stare. A man named Frank Harrow, who farmed the lower acreage, was the first to call it the Heron House. "It's a bird, Brian," he yelled one afternoon while Brian hammered floorboards, "nesting up there like a heron. You expecting a flood or just scared of the dirt?" The men around him laughed. Brian kept nailing. The ridicule settled into a daily rhythm. Every time he rode into the trading post, the jokes were waiting. They said he'd built his cabin so high so he could look down on the rest of them. They said his wife must be a saint to climb a ladder 8 months pregnant. Lisa never complained in public, but her silence in the evenings was heavier than any words. Samuel, their son, was 8 years old then. The boy asked his father one night, "Why don't we live down by the creek like everyone else?" And Brian simply said, "Because the creek will lie to you." What Brian had seen in the scar lines of old floods was that the creek's bed was a thimble compared to what the meltwater could carve. The whole valley was a funnel. In a fast thaw, the runoff from 12 miles of mountain snowpack would converge into that single narrow channel. A cabin on low ground would be chest deep in an hour. There was no escape route when the canyon walls were slick with mud, but no one wanted to hear that. They built their homes, planted their crops, buried their dead in that valley. The idea of leaving the rich bottomland was unthinkable. The autumn of 1880 brought an early cold that set everyone's teeth on edge. Snow began falling in October, heavier than any old-timer could remember. By December, the drifts on the high ridges were already over 20 feet deep. The men who laughed at Brian's stilts started eyeing their own foundations. Frank Harrow visited the Heron house for the first time that January. He didn't climb the ladder. He stood below, looking up at Brian on the porch and said, "You keep preaching doom, but my farm stood for 6 years. You've been up there for 2. What do you know that the rest of us do?" Brian put down his coffee tin and looked at the sky. "I know what happens when 5 feet of snow melts in 3 days of warm rain, and this winter's got more than 5 feet up there." Frank shook his head and walked away. Lisa felt their baby kick that night, hard enough to make her gasp. She lay in the dark beside Brian, listening to the wind outside. "What if they're right?" she whispered. "What if we're just the fool family on the hill?" Brian was quiet for a long moment. "Then if I'm wrong," he said, "we'll climb down and live like everyone else. But if I'm right, the ladder won't matter." The thaw began on the last day of February, 1881. A warm Chinook wind rolled over the mountains, and the temperature rose 17 degrees in half a day. Snow melted so fast that the creek started roaring by noon. Brian stood on his porch and watched the water rise. Samuel carried the ladder up onto the deck. Lisa barred the shutters. Down in the valley, Frank Harrow was still laughing, but his wife was not. She had seen the creek jump its banks once before, and all that water, all that terrible water, had nowhere to go but down toward the low ground where every other home stood. Brian pulled his family inside and bolted the door. The stilts had been built for this moment, but even he couldn't see the horror that was already racing toward the valley. The horror arrived as a wall of brown water that came around the bend with the sound of 1,000 trees snapping at once. The Chinook had held through the night, a warm tongue of air licking the snowpack, until the mountains wept floods instead of trickles. By dawn on the second day, the creek that had watered Bitterroot Valley for a century was gone, replaced by a churning river half a mile wide. It carried everything: whole pines torn root from soil, the bloated bodies of livestock, a wagon that somersaulted like a child's toy before splintering against the canyon wall. The low ground where Frank Harrow and 24 other families had built their lives disappeared in under an hour. First the root cellars flooded, then the floors, then the rooftops. People scrambled upward as the water rose, clutching children and whatever they could grab. Those who reached their roof stayed there, screaming into the wind. Those who didn't vanished beneath the brown churn. Inside the raised cabin, Brian Calder stood at the window, watching. The water had climbed 7 feet up the cedar pilings, then 10, then 12. It lapped at the floorboards beneath his feet, but it did not enter. The Heron house held. Lisa sat behind him, one hand braced against the weight of her belly, the other gripping Samuel's shoulder so hard her knuckles were white. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The screams drifting up from the valley said everything. Samuel pressed his face to the glass. "Papa, there's a woman in the water," he whispered. Brian's jaw tightened. He had prepared for the flood to spare his family. He had not prepared for the sound of his neighbors dying. But hidden beneath the cabin, lashed to the innermost pilings with tarred rope, was a flat-bottomed punt that Brian had built in secret 2 winters ago. Lisa had called it another of his obsessions, a boat in a landlocked valley. Brian had only shrugged and said, "Water finds its own paths." Now he pulled on his coat and opened the trapdoor in the floor. Icy air and the roar of the flood came screaming through. Lisa grabbed his arm. "You can't go down there. The current will smash you against the posts." Brian looked at her, then at Samuel, then at the cabin walls that had held against everything so far. "If I don't go, who will?" He tied a length of rope around his waist, fixed the other end to the door hinge, and lowered himself through the trapdoor into the freezing dark beneath the house. The punt was still there, bobbing against its tethers. He dropped into it, untied the lines with numb fingers, and pushed off into the flood with a single oar. The valley was unrecognizable. Brian had memorized every stand of trees, every fence line, every bend of the old creek. None of it remained. In its place was a brown inland sea dotted with the rooftops of his neighbors. The first he reached was the Simmons place, where a young couple and their 3 children had taken refuge on the shingles. The father, a man named Elias Simmons, saw Brian's boat emerging from the mist and began to weep. "I thought you'd come to watch us drown," he shouted over the roar. "I watched you build that damn birdhouse for years." Brian guided the punt alongside the roof. "Get in," he said. All of you. As the children tumbled into the boat, Elias fumbled in his wet coat and pulled out a handful of coins, silver and copper, maybe a month's wages. Take it, it's everything, he said. Brian pushed the hand away. I don't take money for what the water gives, but I'll take something else. When you're safe, I want your story, the truth of what you felt when you thought you'd die. Every word. Elias stared at him, then nodded. He began to speak there in the boat, his voice shaking. He spoke of the moment the water shattered his door, of the way his wife's face had changed, of the prayer he'd said aloud even though he'd never believed in God. Brian stored every word in his memory. He made 4 more trips in the next hour. Each rescue had its own cost. Mary Halstead, a widow of 60 years who had once called the Heron House an insult to common sense, clutched a wet cat to her chest and told Brian about the son she'd lost to a river 30 years before, a boy she'd never spoken of to anyone. A pair of brothers, Dutch and Elias Voss, confessed they once burned a neighbor's hay barn in a feud, a secret they'd carried for a decade. A young schoolteacher named Alice Fern said she'd been pregnant and unmarried, suffering in silence, waiting for the river to claim her shame. The stories poured out, raw and unguarded because the water had stripped away every pretense. Brian guided the boat, listened, and remembered. Then he found Frank Harrow. The man who had named the Heron House was clinging to the upper branches of a half-submerged cottonwood tree. His face was gray with cold, his clothes torn, his hands bleeding from the bark. The lower branches around him were snagged with debris, the bodies of 2 of his sheep. When Frank saw Brian's boat, he didn't call for help. He just stared, his mouth working soundlessly, as if he'd already accepted that the man he'd mocked for years would sail past. Brian steered the punt through a gap in the tangled limbs. "Give me your hand, Frank." He pulled the shivering man aboard. Harrow collapsed in the bottom of the boat, coughing up brown water. When he finally looked up, his eyes were broken. "My wife is gone," he said. "The water took her, she was right behind me, and then she was." The silence between them stretched. Then Harrow said, "I knew." His words came out in a rasp. "I knew this valley flooded. 20 years ago I saw the old flood lines when I first claimed the land. I thought it would never happen again in my lifetime. I gambled her life on that. I gambled all of them." Brian rowed in silence, the oar dipping slowly. This was the story Frank Harrow would never have told otherwise. It was the confession of a man who had chosen convenience over truth, and the truth had finally come for him. The afternoon light was dying. The water had risen another 2 feet, and new currents were swirling through the canyon. Brian's arms burned, his hands were raw, but he could still hear more voices in the distance. He'd collected 7 stories already, enough for any man. Yet he turned the boat back into the flood because that was who he was now. Not a hermit on stilts, not a madman, but the keeper of the valley's final truths. Lisa's face from the cabin window haunted him, her silent plea to come home. But home was no longer a place. It was a responsibility. As darkness fell, the screams became fewer, but a new sound rose. A baby's thin cry, carried across the water from somewhere near the old sawmill. Brian's heart seized. There was a family with a newborn in that cluster of cabins beyond the mill. He hadn't reached them yet. He pulled hard on the oar, the punt straining against the current, and headed into the black water. The rope around his waist was still tied to the boat, a lifeline he'd almost forgotten. But as the sawmill's sagging roof came into view, he realized the full danger. The current had carved a deep chasm there, a whirlpool that spun debris in fast circles. The baby's cries were coming from the far side, where a broken porch still clung to the mill's frame. Reaching that porch meant crossing the whirlpool. If he capsized, no one would ever know the stories he carried. The next few minutes would decide whether Brian Calder died a fool's death or became the man the valley would remember. Brian dug the oar into the churning water and pulled with everything he had left. The punt shuddered as the whirlpool caught its stern, spinning the little boat sideways and tilting it hard toward the black funnel at the center. Icy spray slapped his face, blinding him. The baby's cries cut through the roar, thin and desperate, and that sound was the only compass he had. He threw his weight against the oar, levering the bow around inch by inch, until the current released its grip and the punt shot forward like a stone from a sling. It crashed against the broken porch of the sawmill, nearly splintering the gunwale. Brian grabbed the wet planks with raw fingers and hauled himself up. Inside the sagging structure, a young mother named Cora Hemsley was pressed into a corner with her infant bundled against her chest, her eyes wide with a terror that had already passed through hope. She was barely conscious, her lips blue, her dress frozen stiff. Brian lifted her and the baby into the boat, tore a strip of canvas from his coat and wrapped it around them both. Cora tried to speak, but her voice came out as only a whisper. "My husband, he tried to swim for help. He didn't come back." Brian nodded and said, "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." As he rode away, she did, haltingly, the story of a man who had cut down every tree on their claim, unaware that the trees were holding the hillside soil, unaware that the erosion had already doomed their land long before the flood. Brian filed every word in his mind. The night deepened, and the water continued to rise. But Brian now knew something worse than the flood itself. The roar upstream had changed. It was no longer just the sound of rushing meltwater. There was a new note, a grinding, metallic shriek that echoed off the canyon walls. He'd heard that sound once before, in the Sierra foothills in '62, the night the logging company's splash dam gave way. A splash dam was a temporary wooden barrier built to hold back a creek until enough water accumulated to flush logs downstream. When they failed, the results were catastrophic. Brian steered toward higher ground, his mind racing. There were no mining flumes in this valley, unless someone had built one in secret. The answer came in the form of a man clinging to a floating bait shop sign. His name was Thomas Redfield, a former bookkeeper for the Bitterroot and Cascade Timber Company. He was half delirious, babbling about a lock gate that had been wedged open to save the winter cut, about a surge they'd expected to control but couldn't. Brian pulled him aboard, and Redfield, thinking he was about to die, confessed everything. The company had dammed a tributary high in the mountains to stockpile water for a spring log drive. When the Chinook melted the snowpack faster than anyone imagined, the dam's spillway couldn't cope. The foreman ordered the main gate closed, but the mechanism jammed. Someone took an axe to the lock, trying to free it, and the entire structure blew out. A reservoir of 1 billion gallons of water had been released in a single minute. The flood that drowned Bitterroot Valley was not an act of God. It was an accounting error covered up in real time. Redfield sobbed as he spoke, naming names, dates, a specific ledger page he'd hidden in a dry box in the company office. No one was supposed to know, he said. Brian's hands tightened on the oar. He had studied flood patterns for a decade and he had missed this variable. But now he had the missing piece. The story wasn't just survival, it was murder. The weight of that knowledge settled over him like a second flood. He had 12 people in the punt now, more than it was ever designed to hold. The water line was inches from the gunwale. He could take no more, and yet the cries continued. He made a choice no man should have to make. He rowed for the cabin, for the safety of the Stilts, promising himself he would return. Lisa saw him coming from the window, and when he pulled alongside the ladder, she wept. They offloaded the shivering survivors into the dry warmth of the Heron house. Samuel helped with blankets. Cora's baby finally fell asleep. For an hour the cabin was a sanctuary, but Brian could not stay. He told Lisa about the dam, about the ledger, about the stories he had already gathered. She looked at him with something between fury and admiration. "You're going back out there," she said. "It wasn't a question." "The water starting to go down," he said. "But if anyone else is alive, they won't last till morning, and I need the truth, all of it, every version." Lisa pressed a piece of dried bread into his hand and turned away. The second wave of rescues was slower. The floodwaters were receding, but the landscape had become a maze of debris. Overturned wagons, dead horses, shattered planks, and tangled ropes made every stroke of the oar a gamble. Yet Brian pulled 3 more people from rooftops and floating doors by dawn. A teenage boy who had seen his father swept away while trying to save a plow horse. A blacksmith who had cracked his ribs diving underwater to free a trapped dog. And an elderly indigenous woman named Kayalia from the small Paiute settlement upriver, who spoke little English but communicated through gestures and a worn leather journal. She had been camped near the dam site. She had seen the explosion of water, had tried to warn the valley, but no one listened to her people. Her testimony would later become the most damning of all. When Brian finally pulled the punt back under the cabin, his arms were beyond pain. The sun was rising over a shattered valley. The Heron House stood alone, absurd and triumphant, its brown pilings crusted with ice but unbowed. 37 people had taken refuge in that small, ridiculous cabin built above the snow line. Almost half of them owed their lives to a boat they'd mocked as a fool's ornament. And Brian Calder, the lunatic on stilts, now possessed something more valuable than any mining claim. He had the unvarnished confessions of a community that had faced its own death. He had the ledger page hidden in Redfield's coat. He had the seed of a book that would not only expose the Bitterroot and Cascade Timber Company, but also rewrite the way the West understood its own rivers. But the reckoning was just beginning. The water would recede in the coming days, leaving behind mud, corpses, and a thirst for blame. The company men would come, and they would try to silence what Brian had uncovered. The question was no longer whether the Heron House would survive. It was whether the truth would. The water receded on the fourth day, draining away in a slow, filthy tide that left the valley looking like a carcass picked clean by vultures. Where there had been a brown inland sea, there was now a field of destruction. Dead sheep bloated on fence lines, cabin logs scattered like matchsticks, a church bell half buried in mud half a mile from where the church had stood. The smell was the worst part, the sweet reek of drowned cattle and waterlogged grain stores turning to rot under the returning sun. 17 bodies were recovered in the first 2 days. 11 more were never found. The survivors huddled in the Calder cabin or on the slopes above the wreckage, wrapped in blankets Brian had stored for this moment, drinking melted snow he had the foresight to collect. Nobody called him a madman now. Nobody called him anything. They just looked at the stilts and shook their heads, trying to understand how a man they had mocked for years had become the one dry refuge in a drowned world. On the morning of the 5th day, Lisa went into labor. The baby, a girl they would name Althea, was born in the Heron House while mud still dripped from the floorboards and strangers pressed against the walls to give the midwife room. Brian held his daughter in the same arms that had pulled 14 people from the current. He looked at her tiny face and made a promise he had never spoken aloud before. The truth of this flood would not be buried with the dead. The company men had other plans. They arrived on horseback on the 6th day, 3 men in dark wool coats with a satchel of documents and a tin box of gold coins. Their spokesman was a man named Cyrus Peck, the Bitterroot and Cascade Timber Company's district agent, clean-shaven and soft-spoken, with the eyes of a man who had ended a dozen disputes without a single bullet. He sat in the Calder cabin with the ledger page hidden only inches from his polished boots, and he presented a settlement. The company would graciously provide funds to help the survivors resettle elsewhere, he explained, provided they signed papers acknowledging the flood was an unavoidable act of nature. The word dam was never spoken. The word reservoir was never uttered. The gold in the tin box was the price of silence. Elias Simmons, the man who had wept when Brian's boat appeared, looked at the coins and reached for them. Then he looked at Brian. "Tell me what to do," he said. Brian stood up. He took no pleasure in what came next. He walked to the corner of the cabin, pulled up a loose floorboard, and produced the ledger page Thomas Redfield had hidden. Then he read aloud the entry that described the dam's lock mechanism failing, the order to destroy the gate, the foreman's notation, spillway unsalvageable, full release unavoidable, advise no written report. The silence that followed was heavier than the flood itself. Cyrus Peck's soft smile never faltered, but his eyes went dead as stone. Brian handed the page to Elias Simmons. "This is worth more than money," he said. "This is the truth, sign nothing." Within a week, the story had broken beyond the valley. A young newspaperman from Helena named Arthur de Vries heard the rumors of a stilt house that had survived a disaster, rode in through the mud, and interviewed every survivor. The testimonies Brian had collected, the raw confessions of the dying and the saved, became the spine of a front-page exposé. The Bitterroot and Cascade Timber Company was indicted for criminal negligence. Thomas Redfield's confession, given in a boat under the shadow of death, became the prosecution's centerpiece. Kay Alia's testimony, translated and entered into the record, confirmed that her people had warned the company foreman about the snowpack weeks before the Chinook arrived. Her leather journal, filled with sketches of the dam site and notes in her own script, was shown to the jury. It was, the prosecutor said, the only pre-flood record of what the company had done. The trial lasted 3 months. Brian Calder testified calmly, without theatrics, and presented not only the ledger but a manuscript. He had spent every night after the water receded writing down the stories he collected aboard the punt, word for word, exactly as they were told. The confessions, the regrets, the last words of men who had watched their families vanish. The book was called What the Water Took, and its publication in the spring of 1882 sent a shockwave through the territory. It was not merely an account of a flood. It was a mirror held up to the arrogance of a frontier that believed nature could be subdued by force. The company's defense collapsed. Cyrus Peck disappeared before the verdict, taking a train east and never looking back. The Bitterroot and Cascade Timber Company was dissolved by court order, its assets seized to pay restitution to the survivors and the families of the dead. Nothing could bring back the 17 bodies, but the truth had been dragged into the sunlight, and the men responsible had been named. In the years that followed, the Heron House became something else. Settlers from 3 territories wrote to Brian, asking for the design of his stilts. He never charged for the plans. He drew them by hand, mailed them in oilskin envelopes, and asked only that the recipients tell him their own flood stories in return. A small archive of letters grew in a cedar chest under his floorboards, each one a testament to a disaster avoided. By 1890, elevated cabins had appeared along flood-prone rivers from the Willamette to the Missouri. The principal Brian Calder had stumbled upon in a Sierra flood as a young man, that water would always follow the path of least resistance, and that resistance could be engineered by listening, not fighting, became a quiet cornerstone of Western settlement. But the final surprise was not revealed until long after Brian's death. In 1912, a hydrologist named Samuel Calder, the boy who had helped sink the first pilings when he was 8 years old, published a study in the Journal of the American Geographical Society. It was titled The Snow Load Threshold: Predictive Patterns in Mountain Flood Cycles of the Northern Rockies. The paper drew on his father's meticulous observations, the measurements Brian had taken every winter from the Heron House porch, the flood lines he had mapped, the stories he had transcribed. Samuel's work became the foundation for the modern flood prediction system used by the United States Reclamation Service. The boy who had once asked, "Will the trees really stop winter?" had grown into the man who taught engineers how to listen to snow, and it all traced back to a cabin on stilts that everyone had laughed at. The Heron House still stands today, preserved as a historical monument on a grassy slope above the Bitterroot River. The cedar pilings have been replaced twice, but the frame is original. Carved into the lintel above the door, in letters you can still trace with your fingers, are 5 words Brian Calder scratched there the night the water finally fell. No one was supposed to know. He meant it as a reminder that truth has a way of surfacing, that the voices of the drowned do not stay silent forever. And in the quiet of that small cabin, high above the ground where the flood once raged, the stories still echo. We like to believe that disasters are acts of God, that they fall from the sky without warning and leave us helpless. But Brian Calder's story tells us something different. It tells us that the warnings are almost always there, buried in the shape of the land, in the memory of an old flood line, in the silence of a woman whose people have watched the snowpack for centuries. What separates the saved from the drowned is not luck. It is the willingness to listen when listening makes you look like a fool. The Heron House was not just a feat of engineering. It was a monument to a rare kind of courage, the courage to trust your own observations when the entire world is calling you mad. Brian Calder did not outsmart the flood. He outhumbled it. He accepted that the water would go where it wanted, and he chose not to stand in its way. That is not weakness. It is the hardest strength there is. In the decades after the disaster, as elevated cabins spread across the western rivers and Samuel Calder's research reshaped hydrology, the laughter that once greeted the Stilt house faded into something else. It became respect, then imitation, then memory. But the deeper lesson of Bitterroot Valley was never fully absorbed, because we still build in floodplains. We still trust dams that someone swore would hold. We still assume that because a disaster has not happened in living memory, it will not happen at all. And so the question remains, how many of us are living in a valley that hasn't flooded yet? How many of our certainties are built on ground that was never safe but only lucky? What truth are we ignoring right now because hearing it would cost too much? Brian Calder asked those questions in a time when asking them meant losing your reputation, your friendships, maybe your home. He asked them anyway. And when the water came, he didn't gloat. He built a boat. He opened his door. He collected the stories of the broken and the guilty and the wise, and he made sure those stories would outlive the mud. That is the real legacy of the Heron House. Not the stilts, not the design, not even the trial that brought down a corrupt company. The legacy is the idea that truth belongs to everyone, especially when it has been buried. That the people who see what's coming owe a debt to those who don't. And that sometimes the fool on the hill is the only one who can save the village. If you want more stories about the men and women who saw what nobody else could, who stood against the tide and turned out to be right, then subscribe to this channel. We're digging into the forgotten corners of history to find the moments when ordinary people did something extraordinary. Hit the bell, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment telling us what you would have done if you'd seen Brian building that cabin on stilts. Would you have laughed? Or would you have helped? I'll see you in the next one.